Good to go? Okay. So I guess we'll get started. My name's Donovon Heap. Yeah, so we'll get started. So I'm doing a presentation on Xamarin, sometimes known as Mono. Now, as of last Monday, they might be folding it all into .NET Core. Just a few days ago at a Linux convention, Microsoft announced that .NET will now be included with some distributions of Linux out of the box. So it's really exciting times, especially recently. A lot of exciting things are happening really quickly. Even just a few years ago, it wasn't at all close. Like, it seems weird to think of Microsoft as kind of going this route, just because it's kind of what they're not known for or infamous for. So yeah, and then they're also announcing Linux or SQL Server will be on will run under Linux, and then in the Windows 10 anniversary update coming fairly soon, they'll be including Bash and command line tools for Windows, so you can run Linux, well, those type of programs in Windows 10. So really quickly, to go back to how Mono/Xamarin started and why the names mean what they mean. C# is just a standard. It's been published, so it's open. The .NET compiler that Microsoft uses is just an implementation of those standards. So basically, anyone can go out and make their own implementation, and that's what these guys did. Started in 2001, so really shortly after .NET first came into being. The head guy that started this was Miguel de Icaza. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. He's known for doing some other open source projects. GNOME, which is that should actually be a capital GNOME, but it's lowercase, so I apologize for the purists out there. It's a desktop environment for Linux. Xamarin was a distribution for Linux as well. He worked at Novell. I don't know if he was actually on site in Provo, but he worked there, or worked for Novell. So the original compiler ran on Linux, and it had mostly console apps. The library, some of the namespaces are proprietary at the time, so Microsoft would kill anything that came out. And then there was some ASP.NET. They came out with another implementation of Silverlight. Silverlight is kind of dead now. Was originally supposed to be like a Flash type competitor that Microsoft produced. But they just kept going. It kind of stayed under wraps, or not under wraps, but just wasn't very popular just because, you know, .NET on Linux was kind of a niche thing. So eventually Novell, Mono was under Novell, and then Novell got bought out by a couple of different people. Now when I drive by the building, it says Microfocus. Does anyone know what that means, Microfocus? Anyway, it doesn't matter. So at this point, when Novell ran, Miguel started his own company, Xamarin, got a license for Mono, which is what the runtime was called. Sorry, it was called Mono. And then they changed it to Xamarin, their distribution of it. And since then, they've come out with, when Android was announced, an iOS, and then a Mac version of the runtime so that you can run .NET code on those platforms. Microsoft kind of has had a hard time with the latest. They had bad timing. They had stuff available, but they just didn't have impact. They had Windows phones type devices. They're usually very clunky. iOS was kind of the first one to come out with a really nice one, and Apple tends to have a large group of people that will evangelize for their products and stuff. So they came in and just hit like a thunderbolt, which kind of left Microsoft a little flat-footed, I guess you could say. And then as the web kind of came into being more of a platform, other languages like Python, Perl, PHP, those type of languages kind of caught on really quickly. Used to be Microsoft required a big investment. You had to buy Visual Studio, a lot of the tools. If you wanted professional versions, were kind of, there's a lot of free tools out there that kind of compete with. So now Microsoft is trying to catch up, and they've done that through various ways. So the powerful thing about Mono, though, is that it's going to possibly answer a pretty big issue, which is write once, run anywhere. Java was supposed to handle that. It does pretty good, but there's not one. Anyway, we'll get to that. So Mono Touch was announced for iOS, and then Mono for Android when Android was announced. It used to be pretty expensive, but now it's free. They had indie versions and professional versions, and then they had their own Xamarin or Studio IDE, kind of like Visual Studio, but from them. And then Mono lives on in other forms. Unity, the game engine, uses some of the scripting type stuff for inside their engine. I don't think it actually has the runtime built in, but maybe it does. I think they use more like the models for it. So how do I run .NET code that would also run on Windows on an Android device or iOS device? Well, they install a runtime on your device. So when you install an Android APK or an iOS IPA install, it actually installs. So if you go to like your Android device and you want to see if someone has installed it for you already, you can check your apps, and if there's one called for like a mono shared runtime, and then the Android is the API version of Android that it's supporting. So it's running. It's just like going onto like an old Windows XP machine, installing .NET Framework 4.0, and does it support XP? Maybe it's whatever. Anyway, so how does it work? So the runtime binds to the native Java SDK and libraries, and does all the support for it. I'm not entirely sure all the nitty-gritty parts of how all that binding works and the grittiness of it. But it seems to work pretty well. The big concerns a lot of people have are with these type of solutions are, the size of the APK. Does the installer include like a bunch of stuff to get it to run, and then performance. It's near native performance. It's not right now. It's not as performance as a pure Java or pure Objective-C or Swift, but it's within 5 to 10%, I believe, according to the benchmarks that I saw. And it's kind of nice because Java is very similar to C#. You could say C# was directly inspired by Java, and then Java's whoever they were. They call theirs a virtual machine instead of a runtime, stuff like that. And then besides Android, I believe BlackBerry is starting to include runtime. They're in desperate times too, so they might just. I think they're now just supporting direct Android apps inside their operating system. So like other options besides Mono, there's been like PhoneGap or Cordova. I think one is like the proprietary system, and the other one's like an open source one. Titanium or web apps, where you just have a web view inside your app and do everything from a website. That's generally called like a hybrid app. They have drawbacks. Each of them have their own strengths and weaknesses. Speed is a big one, and then not everything works the same on Android versus iOS. So we'll get to that in a little bit. So there are drawbacks to Mono or Xamarin. The biggest one is that you're trying to live in two different worlds. You're trying to live in C#, but you're trying to live in a system that wasn't designed for C#. So if you have experience with Objective-C or Swift and Java, then that really helps, because a lot of the resources you're trying to go to are done in those languages. So, and then the UI is completely done the same way. There's some help there coming in the form of Xamarin.Forms, which is going to try to make like a universal UI system. Doesn't matter what platform you're on, but right now it's still really, really experimental. But if you're making it a UI in Android, you basically have to redo the same UI in iOS. So, which is their own different world. So we'll get to that too in a second. Just recently, Google and Oracle were in a lawsuit about whether or not Google had infringed on Oracle. They bought Java, but whether or not they had infringed on their rights. The first case said APIs were not copyrightable, so there's no reason to get a license. But then an appeals court said, no, APIs are copyrightable. So then there was a lawsuit about whether or not it was fair use to use them. It finally came down in favor of Google. So anyway, and then supposedly, I don't know if this is true, but I heard about it. I couldn't find the source for it that I heard, but supposedly Google had like a .NET backup option. Like if things came back worse to worse, they would fall back to .NET. But instead, they're going to, like I said, open Java implementation, so they don't have to worry about Oracle coming after them again. Now the big thing is like, but the big thing about Mono and Xamarin is you get to use C#, which is good, and you can use Visual Studio. And it's probably, in my opinion, the easiest cross-platform native tool, meaning you're running native bytecode, well, not native bytecode, but and then the size of the app is fairly similar. Basically, if you just build like one simple app, it's about 5 megabytes, I think. If you just do a straight other one, then it's like 1 meg. But at the very base, it's going to be 5 meg, which is not too bad. And then, like I said, Java is very much like C#. So if you can read C#, you can probably figure out what they're doing in Java. For iOS and Mac, if you're doing Android, Windows will get you where you want to go. With iOS or Mac programs, they have their own requirements, which is why I'm using a MacBook right now. Because if you want to use iOS, you need a Mac to compile for you some parts of it. And same with the Mac, which also requires an Apple developer account, if you want to do more than just debug. If you want to deploy to a device, you have to go into the Apple developer account, website, add the device. It's a bunch of garbage. Not garbage, but I don't like it. So what we're going to do right here, so there is kind of a way to still use Visual Studio without on a Mac, and it's this Mac operating system. I'm using a Windows VM to run Visual Studio. And if you're doing an iOS project, oh, that's kind of small. You guys, anyway. So if you have an iOS project in your Visual Studio, you can actually, Visual Studio can hook up to a Mac on the network. But because I'm in a VM, I bridge the VM to the host. And so I'm pointing the guest Windows to the host Mac to build for me. Does that make sense? So, so it's kind of a way to kind of still use an all-in-one. Otherwise, you'd have to have a Mac everywhere you wanted to go to a separate Mac. Really quickly. So like I said, so once you get into the source code, I'll go back into there, but this is just like a quick explainer. So this is just like an Android app, the very, very basic one. A Java developer would look at it and be like, oh, it looks very, very similar to Android, or an Android guy, Java. There are a few things like the attributes above the class is where it builds from the Android manifest. I'm trying to avoid talking a lot about kind of specific things, but we'll take it right there. So now, in this Visual Studio solution, I have two apps. I have an Android app and then an iOS app. Now at this point, it's still, the structure is still very same to an Android. So if you're familiar with Android Java, this looks very, very similar. The C# code looks very, very similar, but you're still living in an Android world, which has generally been Java-based. So if you're looking for documentation stuff, chances are it's probably going to be Java. So you have to do some translation, but you can still do all your stuff like in Android. They're still intents. It's all the calls are still there, depending on the API version that you're targeting. So right now, this is a big get for me. I can use Visual Studio and make Android and iOS apps. And if you open up the iOS app, looks very, very similar to an Objective-C type scenario, or Swift, or whatever you're on. You still have your info.p list with all your settings and stuff. So right now, just this is really, really cool for me because I can use C# Visual Studio to make an app. And then if I run it, if I had an iOS device, I should have tried to steal one. Not steal, but borrow. I can make this work. My phone, if you're trying to, you can use the emulator, which is just like another virtual machine of like the Android device. You can use that, but this computer doesn't have enough space. I would not recommend doing this with like a MacBook Air of this type because it's not very powerful, so it's really slow and kind of clunky. But it's more for demonstration purposes. But you can also set up all your USB so that if you plug in your Android phone, then you can talk to it in the guest and run against it. But right now, if you can run these and they work if you have all the settings set up correctly. So right now, that's a big get. Down here. I even, in my Android version, I added a reference to just a .NET library called Donzam. And it's just a .NET library I just built. It just has one class, one method. I just built in Visual Studio, no special settings. Depending on what your namespace is, you may run into issues, but we'll get into that too a little bit later. So right now, the other powerful thing is now I can use .NET libraries inside of my Android solution. So down here I used my Xamarin example, and then I used my method. And then you can, so you get all the power and feature of Visual Studio and C#, and then you can actually use that same library inside of the iOS project. So this way. So now comes the more complex part about sharing code, is how you want to do it. You can either do just like a plain vanilla library, or you can go the different routes of either using a shared asset, which is you add a project to your solution, and then as you code, you'll eventually get into parts where Android and iOS are different. They don't do things the same way. Even in C#, you just can't figure out what you're trying to do. So you have to code around each different platform. You can do that either these shared assets or a pickle, which is a portable class library. If you're using a shared, and even then there's different ways you can do it. You can check to see in your code, you can check to see what you're building for and do the code differently. If you're using a PCL, you can set a target to, so this is very simple. There's a better, I didn't want to do too much with this example because I have a much better project which I'll open, but this is like the very, very basic one. So for this one, I added a portable class library and then a shared project, each with their own classes. They basically do the same thing. But if you're doing a portable class library, when you make it, you specify what you want to target. So down here, this is targeting basically Android, Windows Phone, and Windows.iOS, or not Windows.iOS, iOS. So because of that, this class library can only do things that support, in the .NET framework, everything that's supported in that list. So if I wanted to do a database call, iOS and Android do it separately. So I can't use that part of the framework inside this library and then share it with those. What you can do is set up an abstract class and then implement it in both of the projects. So you still have kind of the same class, but it's implemented differently. You can also do the same thing with checking to see what you're building for, and then implementing it differently down the different ways. So, pardon?
You can use dependency injection and service.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah. You can use all the different tools available. Kind of a cool thing. But that's just more like how you want to do it. Some people prefer to use the pickles for packages that you can deploy to third parties, or you're going to put on NuGet. A lot of them will be pickles. So there's iOS and Android, and then they also have one for. So if you didn't want to, hold on a second. So anyway, so now let's switch to the more robust project that they provide as their.
So this is the demo Xamarin project.
Sorry, what?
You said they provide that Xamarin. So you're showing us
Yeah, this is just their sample project. Yeah, just kind of show you how everything works. So in this one, this includes Android, iOS, and Windows Phone. But because I don't have enough space to include everything for the Windows Phone 8, I decided not to install it. So that's why it's saying unavailable. But so in this one, they called theirs a little different. They called their Tasky.core as their shared project, and then they have their unit tests, and then their Android version and their iOS version. If you want to go in here, you can see instead, let's go into their shared library and look at a task and see what they include. So this right here looks like it's a database. It implements contracts. Oh yeah. So yeah. This is for a database call. So now, if we look inside the Android version, they did theirs a little differently. They didn't include a direct reference to the project inside the references. They actually added the actual, actual class back into the project. So it's still the same file, but it's included inside the solution. Oh, sorry. Yeah, linked it. Yeah, sorry. That's where I was looking for. Yeah. So that's another way you can do it. Instead, if you just want to add a reference to the shared project, you can just add a symbolic link, I guess. I've been over for it. But you still, so now we can see inside of this Android project, they include this, they use this task. This task from their core library, which is kind of what they call their shared project. And then if we look at their iOS version, it's going to do basically the exact same thing. Same linking, same file, and then inside their code. Same, oh, not the exact same code, but they use the same library. And this is the part where it gets kind of, where you're trying to live in two worlds, because this code for iOS is so much different than the Android version, which would be so much different than the Windows Phone version. But if you can architect it well enough, then basically the only thing is really to worry about is this specific code and then your UI. Speaking of the UI, resource. There it is. The UI layouts files still stay basically the same. This is the exact same layout structure that Java, Eclipse, Android Studio would use. So that part stays the same. It's an XML layout, and then with iOS, it's another very similar type of situation. Sorry, this is so small for me. I forgot where it goes on iOS. But so at this point, you can still kind of see what they're trying to accomplish and share code. Any questions so far or comments or? Yeah, so they recommend trying to keep business logic out of your UI, and then, which is generally a good idea. But if you want to share as much code as possible, yeah, keep your business logic out of your UI.
So I guess I'm just trying to summarize what I understand so far. So business logic is shared, except for there is some wackiness with the shared library. Sometimes Java is different, or iOS is different than Android.
Yeah.
Sometimes you have to abstract that away and hide it. And the interface, eventually, right now, current state of technology, Xamarin don't think it's capable enough to really provide a cross-platform user experience.
Right now it's still in alpha, and
the recommendation that comes from Xamarin themselves is that unless you need something pixel perfect, forms is where you should head, because they do have translations on most all of the common controls across different platforms, similar to what jQuery does to JavaScript.
Okay. Sorry, it depends on what you're trying to do, I guess.
So it sounds like it's news that everyone's trying to learn it at the same time. But for this comment, it sounds like, particularly in vanilla UI, it's basic screens, nothing spectacular. Xamarin seems to claim that you can do the Xamarin, and your experience may be different.
Yeah, it's been a while. I mean, is it? I mean, I thought it was still on alpha stage. It might be.
No.
Oh no, it's not.
No, it's fully formed.
Oh, okay.
There are some particularities with iOS. Most frequently it's with iOS, of course, because Apple is different. But for the most part, yeah, they translate nicely. There are several stat layouts, scroll layouts, views for all of the major controls that you need are there.
The one I ran out was with kind of like a tab layout. With iOS, it always had to be at the bottom. So for Android, it would appear at the top, but for iOS, it would appear at the bottom. And so that was stuff that kind of made it so like it wasn't the same. Like it didn't match with what I was trying to do with the UI.
It's all built in. It will do Xamarin forms to do the compilation and switch it to whatever the platform specific layout is.
But the same app, like the tabs would be at the top versus at the bottom, which was different than what I wanted the UI to always have the tabs at the top. So that was just so I think if Xamarin Forms can get you where you need to go, then it's probably the simpler explanation or a simpler way to do it. Otherwise, that gets rid of a lot of your UI code.
The other question is, you a couple times, you were a very capable Android developer and you picked up Xamarin. So you can Android and iOS. Is that really a precondition to Xamarin? You simply need to know the native development environments well enough to know what the pieces are and how they fit together? Or is that requirement vanished?
It's just an advantage at this time. Right now, it's just like if you weren't using WinForms, but if you're going from like WinForms to WPF, it's probably a more drastic change. It's just you're just going through like a different set of libraries, and it's really. But the problem right now, like a lot of the resources that you check like online or places you go to find help, like Stack Overflow and stuff, a lot of the Android stuff is still in Java. So you'd have to say like, oh, this is what they're doing in Java. Just what do I need to do the same thing in C#, which is it's pretty easy. So it's not a requirement. It's just beneficial.
Because that said, it's helpful to know Java if C#. The other part is always the specific, like Android integration files, integration settings.
Yeah, and then a lot of those aren't specific to Java. It's been so long in Java that a lot of the resources available are still, assuming you're using Java, not C#. So, if that makes sense. So it's not a requirement. It's just something nice to have. Same with iOS is probably most difficult. But anyway, at least for me to catch up on. I wasn't familiar with Objective-C or Swift or any of those. So, so at this point, you're still kind of living in like a normal .NET environment. You're using Visual Studio. You're in Windows. You do have to kind of like hook up some stuff. You do have to do some package management. If you want to deploy, you still deploy the same way as an Android or as a Java app, but it's not specific to Java. The other option, if you're using a Mac or in Windows, they also have this for Windows too, but is they have their tool Xamarin Studio, which is basically the same, kind of like their version of Visual Studio, but it runs on Mac. Last year, Project Mac got really excited because last year Microsoft announced that when Visual Studio was coming to Mac, it was Visual Studio Code, and it got really excited, like, oh, you can all use Macs now. We don't need Windows. But Visual Studio Code is just like a very, very simple shell, I guess. So this is that same project, but in Xamarin Studio running on Mac. Same structure, same artist, same everything. Sorry, what?
Like your business logic libraries that are in .NET, you can code and maintain those inside Xamarin Studio, or you still need Visual Studio.
No, I don't think so. Okay. So like with this Xamarin Studio, I could basically do everything that I did in Visual Studio. But the only one I haven't been able to find out to use Visual Studio, and this probably will stay this way until they actually come out with Visual Studio fully for Mac, is the Xamarin.Mac product, which is how you can write Mac applications in C#. So this is a Mac app that runs, and it's very, very similar to an iOS project. You can do all the same things, but I think the reason why they require you to have a Mac is because it requires heavily on Xcode for your UI. So on this one, I have a storyboard, which is I think like they used to call them like scenes in .NET or WinForms. It was like scenes where like you could transition between panels and stuff. Is that sound familiar? Anyway. But if I want to edit the UI, I basically have to use Visual Studio for iOS has their own little designer for Android and iOS, but for Mac, you're basically stuck using Xcode. Anyone here use Xcode? Because I struggle with it, but I don't know if it's probably just me, but it's hard for me. Like it's a beast. Yeah. Oh, have you used it before? Yeah, it's a very strange product. At first, I thought maybe I was using the wrong thing the wrong way. But a lot of people say this is what they use to do all their iOS apps and Mac apps, which is it's hard for me to get around. So, yeah. So you're still doing all of your UI stuff in Xcode, but then it syncs back with Xamarin.Mac to get all its sources. So like on this one, this is kind of like their UI layout. They do have Windows as like WinForms would call Windows, but now the new way is to use a storyboard, and change views as the program is running. This is probably this. So the one app that I worked on for production was a port from a Visual Basic to Visual Basic.NET to a C# application, and I took that and ported it to Mac using Xamarin.Mac, and I think it got confusing because the project manager was really kind of expecting like the same look and feel for everything, but in Mac the windows behave so much differently. So like if I have Xamarin Studio open and I hit this little red X, this is just because my Mac stupidity. Like I'm not good with Macs. I've never used them before. So if I hit this X, the app is not actually closed. The window's gone, but the actual app is still alive. What you're supposed to do is go up here and then choose quit, and then that actually fires off kind of like your closed events and stuff. So I learned a lot of this stuff about Macs doing that way, but so with Xcode, you're still required to use the UI if you want to do Mac or apps. And then there's kind of an arduous process to add functionality, like to hook up events or actions or commands. You select the header file of the controller. So this is more binding. So you select the header controller, and then you also, oops, hold on a second. I did that wrong. So if you want to add like a button, which is not plain button, like tree views, like I'm so used to like Windows that it's like, I was looking for a tree view, but it's actually called like a table view. You click and drag it out, and you can set properties. If you ever have to do this, I recommend avoiding clicking on stuff over here to select stuff. Always select stuff out of the tree view. The more you click, you select different stuff. So now I selected the scroll view. I click again, but now I've selected the clip view. So just always select over here is probably what my recommendation would be. And then if you want to, you have to hold down Control, and you can drag it down to the header file, hook it up there, and then you can get into your C# code. So I already did that one for this button. This is just kind of like their sample or their initial project. And then you can set up a partial class. It all uses partial classes, and then you set up your method that way. So this button is tied to that button on the view. So this is the only one that I've really found out where you have to use a Mac environment to do all your cross-platform development, and just because of Xcode, I think. They may come to the point where they do the same thing they did with iOS, but do it for Mac, as far as like the across the network compilation or against a host type thing. But for right now, that's the only one that's stuck kind of in the Mac world. Otherwise, you can probably do everything you need to in Windows Visual Studio. So that was kind of that's kind of like the overview and the very quick journal about doing like a cross-platform libraries. You have a couple different ways to share code, or you can just straight up do everything in C#. I've done that twice. That was quite a while ago. So now with Xamarin Forms, that may have solved a whole lot of heartaches with that type of thing. Another one, they do have a DLL inspector, I guess you could say, or a scanner. And what it will do is it'll tell you, you can use a Silverlight, actually, by chance. Otherwise, you have to upload the DLL. But it scans your DLL, and then I'm guessing it checks the intermediate language, the bytecode, sees what references are used, namespaces, and it'll tell you what's available to use across what platform. So if we go to they have like a little sample. I should just upload one. So it's saying right here. So JSON.NET is almost there. It's at 96% of it. And it'll tell you. Actually, I'll do that real quick. Oh, I need Silverlight, so I have to do it on Windows. Windows here. If this will take too long, I'll just kill it. But we'll continue on. And it'll tell you what of your assembly. Some of the issues I ran in with was more of a hard coding. Oops, that's right. There it is. Hard coding of like path names. So in Windows, they use C:, and then forward slashes or backslashes. In Unix environments, it's the opposite one. So if you're trying to use a library that hard coded those type of paths, don't do that. And then UI headaches. You weren't really able to build a Mac app using a Windows Forms solution, but they had to interrupt the draw commands and do their own implementation of it, and it was slow and ugly and it didn't work right, so they just killed it. And then Xamarin Forms is the solution. It seems like it got much better, but so it's probably a good thing to look into if you're trying to do UI stuff. I think they were going to add some sort of blend support to this, but I'm not sure how far along that was going into it. So that way, front-end designer basically builds up the UI for each one. So why did Microsoft get involved? Whereas before they just kind of ignored it so heavily. They're trying to regain ground. They bought Nokia to try and get a footprint into the mobile world. And then it's hard to catch up, so it might be easier just to port existing apps. For a long time, they were trying to bribe developers to port certain games or certain apps to Windows Phone or Windows 10. They probably don't want to end up like BlackBerry used to be like the default smartphone provider, and now they're kind of changed. And then the world has changed now. Everyone doesn't want a pure .NET environment. They're like, well, we want to use Linux and these databases, but we want ASP.NET website, but we want to use our own devices. We don't want to give everyone a BlackBerry. We want to use an iOS phone, but this guy wants to use Android. So the stack is now very much a very tech stack. And Microsoft's maybe they're saying like we can't compete with that. So we'll try to do what we do really well and do it well, which is I would really like Visual Studio. So and then they've always had the plan of having a one operating system for across all devices. It's called like the Unified Windows Platform. I think it originally started with Xbox. Bill Gates wanted Windows in your living room as your setup box, and then it would also that. There was another one called Project Astoria. It's been dead, but it's kind of been reborn as a different name and kind of a different agenda, I guess you could kind of say. .NET Core and then the Linux on Windows 10 anniversary is kind of doing that. Originally, it was supposed to be like you could take your native Android app, run in Java, and run it on Windows Phone. That's kind of what BlackBerry did. They're like, well, no one's writing apps for BlackBerry anymore, so we'll just support Java. But this is now dead. I think they announced it and killed it last year, I think. So it didn't live very long, but it does kind of change names. And then, of course, if you have like the right ones, oh, you can't see. It's supposed to be. It's supposed to be like two little spiders, and it's like if we pull this off, we'll eat like kings. Because a write once, run anywhere type of scenario is the silver bullet for development, at least to me. Because and then, but how determined are they to support this type of scenario? XNA was supposed to be like a big project, but there is still like a mono XNA, which still kind of lives on, and then Silverlight, which was kind of killed off, and then Nokia, which they just barely sold off after taking a huge loss on what they paid for. So that's kind of, at least that's kind of what it feels like to me. That's probably the big concern is like, well, how long will Microsoft keep this going? But at this point, it seems like it's a do or die for them. Like there are other services which like their cloud server, those type of things. They're diversifying. They support Linux on Azure. They're supporting Linux on SQL Server, that type of thing. So does this work? Oh, that's the wrong. Oops. I'll try this real quick. I'll upload the library I made, and we'll see what it says. Even if the method, or even if the whole assembly doesn't pass, certain methods can that you can use. So the one I used mainly was, I've used a couple different ones, but the biggest one I used was a zipping one, ionic.zip. Let's see how it goes. Anyway, so any questions in the meantime, or comments? Anything I get wrong? I mean, I may have got Xamarin Forms wrong. So if anyone here used, have you used Xamarin, it seems like, or quite a bit?
I've just been going through this. There's a nice little course out there on X and X. So there's loads and loads of videos on Xamarin University.
Yeah. The forms, the Xamarin Forms are probably the nicest resource right now. Like I said, if you get on and you Google like Stack Overflow, a lot of stuff will still be Java specific. Their forums are really good resources. They have a lot of employees that are really within like a few hours answering your questions. And then it seems like now Microsoft is now going to be taking even more of a direct role in directing. You know, they call it .NET Core, but they're probably just going to fold all of the Xamarin stuff into it and then maybe rebrand it. But anyway. And you said you've used Xamarin. What's your experience been like? Or
Yeah, so I'm using Xamarin Forms. I'm writing it out now. And you know, you run into some issues, you know, but I really like it. I haven't published for the stores yet. But yeah, Xamarin Forms seems to be working really well for me.
the last one I tried was last year. So maybe I was probably just using it wrong.
Well, it's in XAML, so if you know WPF, you're kind of already there.
Now, does it do it at compile? Like I remember them saying, like it just actually builds resources, and then at runtime, it reads through that kind of manifest file and then builds the native objects on the fly. Is that?
I don't know. All I know is when I click run, it shows up on the Mac.
Oh.
Yeah, I had to buy a Mac. It's tough too. That was hard to swallow. That was hard to swallow. A lot of that real hard, actually. But then it kind of defeats the purpose of Xamarin.
You can run iOS, or you can run Sex in the virtual.
There you go. That's what I should do. That'd be awesome.
Jerry's good right now.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah. Well, that's kind of what I was just planning to go through. I mean, we can go through like the demo apps more and look at more specifics. And people are, I was just trying to do like a high overview type thing.
I guess the one question that I came up with is when you know when to use a shared library project or a shared project or a class library. Because when you go into Xamarin Forms, there's both of them in there in Visual Studio, right? There's templates for each. I ended up having to use a PCL because the iOS wouldn't run with the shared library. For some reason it's all kinds of errors.
I'm not sure. Do you know if you were using like a certain namespace you didn't like, or?
I think it was the Xamarin Forms thing that didn't like the shared library.
Oh.
So when I threw everything away and restarted with a PCL, everything worked fine.
So Miguel I'm gonna say he's been on a bunch of like seminars recently. Like he's invited to Microsoft a lot. A lot of times he's called a traitor to the open source kind of community. He actually had a blog post just this year, and talks a little bit about whether or not to use a shared project or a PCL. And he references a colleague of his who did a blog post, and is wondering like on when developers should use a shared project or a PCL. Because I actually didn't know it was now pronounced pickles until just I read this blog post. So for him, he says pickles are just too cumbersome for most uses. It's like trying to use a cannon to kill. I'm just going to repeat him because I babble, so I'll just murder. It's like trying to use a cannon to kill a fly. It imposes too many limitations. Force you jump through hoops to achieve some very basic tasks. Pickles, when paired with nougats, are unmatched. Frameworks and library authors should continue to deliver these because they have a low adoption barrier and in general smiles and delight to the users. But for application developers, I stand firmly on the opposite side. He's a fan of simplicity. So he's saying just use the if debug statements, or not debug, but the if platform statements to say. if you're building for iOS, do this. If you're building for Android, so. So I guess I don't know the answer to that one. I don't think anyone does. It's probably just whatever you want to do. So let's try this real quick. Firefox. Oh, did I go to the website? I thought, oh, do I have to? So I don't know if you, so from the blog post from Miguel, he says kind of what you want to do.
Yeah, so I heard that if you use a shared library, you have to use conditional compilation statements for the different libraries.
Yeah.
And then, with the other one, you actually do it inside the specific project itself.
Yeah, so his recommendation is careful use of partial classes.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you could also build, abstracts, interfaces.
But we'll see how this goes. There are some problems. There's some methods in Xamarin too that call page display options. It takes 3 delegates, one for iOS, Android,
Yeah.
and then it automatically switches it based on when it compiles and does.
That's how you can do some of the layout too. You can say like for iOS, move this down 20 pixels. I have nothing bad to say about it. I preface everything with stupid.
Well, so it looks like this isn't gonna. Oh, it's. Oh, that's just like a little notification. I wasn't actually saying. Oh dear. Okay. Oh. Do I have to upload something? Well, anyway, sorry, that didn't work, but it would go through and tell you what parts of your assembly need to be changed for which platform. So, anyway, so that's basically it.